Thank you so much for having me here, and thank you so much for that really warm introduction. I am absolutely honored and thrilled to be talking to all of you today. I would be lying if I said I wasn't also a little bit anxious about talking to all of you today. But I think, and one thing, about is one thing I like to say is, I am Stuart Geiger. I sit at the Berkeley Institute for Data Science, or BIDS, and I've been talking and researching with a lot of people about open source software development. But I am neither a software engineer nor a data scientist. Although I like to say I play one on Github. It's one of those things where, and I say that not because of any kind of deep imposter syndrome or anything, but because at a core I have just a somewhat different role, in this community and in my sort of local institution. One of the things that I've been, that we've been doing as, we've been getting to talk to and research a lot of different open source software projects, both, inside the kind of scientific computing and academic research space and outside, is the sort of just broad diversity of projects and people and motivations and sort of experiences that people have. But I sort of want to, because I'm a researcher, I can't resist doing a little bit of a survey straw poll right now. I'm curious if you could raise your hand if you are a user of any kind of open source software. All right, good. And raise your hand if you are have been a contributor in any way to an open source software project. And if you could raise your hand if you consider yourself kind of a core maintainer of an open source software project. And so, so this talk is something that for a lot of the people and you who are kind of core maintainers maybe not be new to you in terms of your experiences, but I think there are sort of vitally important issues around that I'm hoping to sort of surface and bring to the conversation around the sort of work of maintenance and sustainability. And I'm really sort of thrilled and honored for SciPy to be able to have a dedicated conference track this year thinking about open source sustainability. I think it's a really important and tricky problem. And of all the things that sort of mentioned, I feel like I can only get to a few in this talk. I initially sketched out some slide decks that ended up being a few hours long. So in the interest of time, what I'm going to be focusing on today are issues around kind of invisible work and kind of what that means. And I want to open up with a sort of quote that was one of my favorite quotes from one of my favorite books, which is that a good infrastructure is hard to find. This is by Jeff Bowker and Susan Lee Starr in this fantastic book called Sorting Things Out, which is all about classification systems. And one of the things they mean by that is that infrastructure, when it works correctly, is something that is invisible to people who use it and rely on it. And I feel like this conference, in particular, I'm so grateful to the organizers for organizing this conference and bringing me here. And because with all the people I've talked to in my personal experience, I know how valuable and important conferences can be. And for a lot of you who are attendees, the ability to kind of walk in, grab a badge, put it on, and then walk down the hall and see someone's name that you've seen online but never met in person and say, hey, it's really good to meet you. That happening just instantly without you having to think about all the work that goes in behind the scenes to make this kind of event possible is something that, that's in a certain sense what it means for a good infrastructure to be working well. But it's that kind of paradox that the better an infrastructure works, the more invisible it becomes, the more it sinks into the background. And the less we're able to kind of notice the people and the processes and the resources that go into maintaining and sustaining and keeping it, so that a lot of people who are users of those infrastructures are able to kind of go about their lives and sort of not give it a second thought. And so this is one of the sort of tensions that sort of I would like to sort of discuss, in a lot of this work around open source, which has become critical infrastructure for a variety of sectors, not just in academic research, but also across the tech industry, across government. A lot of nonprofits and non-governmental organizations, have come to rely on a lot of these projects, crucially. But before I begin, I want to give a little bit more of a background about sort of where I am and where I come from as someone, and sort of what I'm doing here as someone who is, neither a data scientist nor a sort of software engineer at my heart of hearts. My background originally, I did kind of try to get into computer science my first time around back when I was in high school. I entered computer science I entered my undergraduate as a computer science major. I had tinkered around with some scripts and was really proud of myself for installing Debian on the home computer and then messing it up and figuring that out. But then when I went to computer science learned that it was, was told it was sort of more about linear algebra and differential equations than kind of what, writing scripts, and I had, had to drop calculus, and so I ended up kind of moving to the other side of campus instead of studying philosophy and history and philosophy of science in particular. And I was, but I was always really interested in the role that computation plays in knowledge production, and that's been one of the kind of common themes throughout a lot of my work, is how, what we know is how knowledge production and the institutions of, science and other related kind of industries and fields are changing. And so I was sort of, steeped in some of the classics, like you might be familiar with, Thomas Kuhn's The Structure of Scientific Revolutions, or sort of work in that kind of classic history and philosophy of science space that I think is still very relevant today for a lot of the challenges that we face in today's sort of modern research environment. And then about midway, actually very early in my graduate career, I kind of discovered ethnography. And ethnography is kind of the method classically of anthropology, where, traditionally anthropologists would sort of would to use the ethnographic method, and by that they meant, would go to kind of faraway places like an island in the Western Pacific and kind of spend long periods of time doing kind of deeply situated and, rich observation, learning of people's customs and language and cultures, and kind of learning that, we're all different in a lot of different ways, but in a lot of ways we're all the same. And that method kind of really struck me, and I kind of moved from asking more philosophical questions to sort of asking those same kind of questions, but by doing empirical research into a lot of different communities. And I'm part of a generation of ethnographers that sort of didn't go into some of the more classic places that anthropologists do, but instead go into scientific research labs and technical institutes. Some of the earliest kind of, my sort of predecessors and the kind of foundational, works in our field, are people who have gone into sort of scientific research labs, like Bruno Latour had this book, with Laboratory Life that was based on his time at the Salk Institute, where he was actually there when researchers there made a discovery that won the Nobel Prize, and he kind of traces out what happened, that entire history of from the hypothesis of that idea and writing it up and before they realize what they've actually found. Or things like Sharon Trawick's Beam Times and Lifetimes, which is all about high-energy physics labs and super collider centers and places like that. And I feel like that's also something, as we're talking about open source sustainability, to think about the kind of infrastructures that are sort of widely used and relied upon in other kinds of scientific fields. Like, I think there's a lot that we can learn, a lot of challenges that, for example, in building super collider centers, super colliders, or other kinds of, research infrastructures that have a lot of parallels to the role that open source software plays in academic research. And now I'm sort of situated in the Berkeley Institute for Data Science, and I got my PhD in 2015, started hanging out there in 2015, started in 2016. And the Berkeley Institute for Data Science is a very interesting and unique place. And it was actually funded by the Moore and the Sloan Foundations as part of 3 research institutes. One was us at Berkeley. There was then the eScience Institute at the University of Washington and the Center for Data Science at New York University. And all 3 of these institutes had 3 different clusters of people who were sort of brought together in the same place. First, there was a lot of people from kind of different domain science research areas who were doing data science-y work in their own disciplines and using a lot of these sort of tools. People from physics or economics or biology who were sort of making advancements in their fields and sort of using a lot of these sort of tools and techniques. As well as people who are sort of open source software developers who are producing, general purpose or discipline specific, kinds of software libraries. And in fact, at BIDS, we have, many of the software libraries that are a part of SciPy are, developed by a lot of people who, spend time at BIDS, including, things like NumPy and scikit-image, and, a lot of people from Project Jupyter have sort of sat in BIDS, as well as the ROpenSci project in the R ecosystem, has a big footprint in BIDS as well. And then, so it's sort of pretty rare for people who are sort of users of those technologies and people who are building those technologies, and people who are sort of hybrids of, both one side or the other, of not one side or the other, but a little bit of both, to be in the same sort of research space together. And then the thing that sort of made it even much more different from even other research institutes is they also put people like me in each of those 3 institutes. Ethnographers whose job it was is to sort of research and reflect and think about, what it is that we're doing and, what is this whole data science thing anyway? What does it need to succeed? Where is it going? And in particular, that's what sort of really led me down a path to sort of focus on open source software and the kind of issues around sustainability and maintenance and infrastructure around that. And I'll share just a little bit of some things that we've sort of done sort of at BIDS in that kind of, sort of meta-research space and kind of One of the things that we've done some work on, we recently published a report last year on career paths and institutional structures in academia for data scientists and software engineers who develop for data scientists. You can see the report, it's a big long report at tinyurl.com/dscareers if you're interested in more. And this is a long 40-page report based on some surveys and interview work and lots of conversations with a lot of people about this, showing many of the difficulties and the sort of, how the kind of academic institutions, need to sort of change and adapt to the sort of changing forms of scholarship that's taking place, both around things like reproducibility in open science, as well as sort of open source software development. And in particular, we identified that there's a lot of sort of hybrid people out there who, don't sort of follow the traditional norm of their own discipline, but are sort of half software engineers and half, domain scientists, or sort of split between, computer science or statistics and, economics or biology. And so we've done a lot of work, particularly also with our own university and the University of California's sort of human resource system as well, to talk about, what it would look like to produce, proper job descriptions and proper reporting structures. And we thought a lot about, what does it mean to be able to sort of support that institutionally. Another thing that we do, I am sort of the leader, or actually, cat herder in chief of this best practices in data science series that we've been running. And you can see some reports that we've done out of this at tinyurl.com/bidsbp. And we've launched, and this is sort of something where we've come together around different topics, around thorny issues in data science, and sort of and get people from a bunch of different backgrounds and disciplines in the same room and work out, for example, on the top left, we had a whole session just on what are the challenges of doing data-intensive research in teams and labs and groups, and those problems of collaboration. We didn't come up with any best practices. We spent the whole time in a long, I think 9-page sort of piece, just what are all the different issues that you might have to face in doing this, not just at a single person, but at scale. And then that kind of spun out into a project on best practices for managing turnover in groups around this. What happened in the importance of things like documentation and process documentation and workflows to be able to support what happens inevitably when people leave and new people come in. We've also sort of put a focus on diversity and inclusion in data science, and done a number of events around that, and sort of have this sort of white paper thinking about what are sort of ways to foster a good workplace culture. This is a very broad effort. We only got to a couple of sort of issues. But on the topic of invisible work, diversity and inclusion is a really important sort of subject to bring up, because a lot of the times the work around diversity and inclusion is sort of seen as, or sort of not sort of rewarded or sort of promoted. It's not sometimes the things that sort of get you the credit needed to advance. And it also is sometimes not equitably distributed. So one of the things that we recommend in that is that diversity and inclusion work is everyone's responsibility. And it's something that should be sort of rewarded and supported, and be part of job descriptions and things like that. And we also have another piece on kind of resistance to adoption of best practices. What happens if you have a best practices document or something that's a good idea, and people sort of don't want to do it? And we sort of shared a lot of experiences around that aspect. But in general, even though I've been situated in open source for the past few years, generally speaking, I study distributed, decentralized communities of knowledge production, and particularly those that produce public goods. And I understand that not all of open source sort of has that sort of framing in terms of seeing itself as a public good, but there's also a lot of other projects outside of open source that sort of fit this model as well, that face many similar challenges. And I think it's really important in these conversations about sustainability to not remain entirely within our own experiences, but to look out at other kinds of analogous projects and communities that also have similar kinds of issues and tensions around the kind of work that they do. So one of these, for example, is science. Scientific research has long been, one of these, has long had a lot of challenging problems around recognizing all the sort of invisible work that goes into making science happen. Just, talk to anyone about sort of peer reviewing or grant writing or things like that, and sort of what gets, what gets someone sort of a faculty position versus what is the work that's actually needed to happen for science to sort of keep going every single day. And one of the interesting things is also this is something that's sort of not new in the history of science. When I put on kind of my history and philosophy of science hat, I've actually been doing a lot of looking into issues around kind of telescope manufacturers in the 1600s and 1700s, which You might be thinking, what's going on with that? But it actually has some very interesting and striking parallels to a lot of the things that the way that I hear people talk about challenges in scientific research around open source software. Telescopes, of course, made massive advancements to astronomy, but they were also one of those sort of, classic kind of dual-use technologies, in that they were important to astronomy and sort of science, but they were also even more important to, some powerful and well-resourced non-scientific organizations, most principally shipping industries and militaries and navies. And there's actually kind of traces in the historical record about, people who were wanting to use telescopes and acquire telescopes for scientific sort of purposes, having to sort of compete with these much more well-resourced organizations and kind of trying to say, where are we going to get these from? And the lens, who has the skills to grind the lenses in the particular ways? And where are those people going to sit? And will these be also available for academia and industry and government? And also the people who also did this kind of work, there was an open question when scientific institutions were just getting formulated about, in things like the Royal Society, about what the role is for those people who had, significant craft and engineering skills in being able to develop and make innovations on sort of optical lenses and things like that. To what extent are those people scientists? To what extent are those people in the Royal Society? And as astronomy kind of moves from being, originally something you could do with the naked eye and knowledge of mathematics and a good clear view of the sky, and was sometimes even seen as sort of more of a branch of mathematics than other kind of analogous disciplines, to something that sort of ends up requiring a lot of engineering expertise and technical skill and resources. You start to see different conversations about how that field starts to change. And I feel like those are the same kind of conversations and issues that I hear about when I talk to people about the tensions in sort of scientific research and the role that open source software plays in that. That was a very long digression on the history of telescopes, which I could go on for far too long, but I actually put this image up to even just say that this is the clip art version of what science looks like. I got it from the BBC. But those of you who are in science know that 80% of science is on the one hand cleaning data and the other hand writing grants. And those are also kind of forms of invisible work in science. And it's important to kind of think about, who does that kind of work and to what extent, that kind of work is understood as being, core aspects of the scientific process. Another aspect that I spent a lot of my time in my research career sort of studying is Wikipedia. And I've been a Wikipedia contributor for a long time, started kind of casually editing in 2003, which was a long time ago. The Wikipedia was a very different place, the internet was a very different place, and have started to then it was sort of my first ethnographic sort of field site to be able to study and interview and talk to people about the issues that sort of they were facing. And Wikipedia and open source software have a lot of similarities to each other as well, in the sense that they're both sort of sustained by large volunteers, large populations of volunteers who do a lot of work. Although there are also people who are paid full-time or part-time to be able to sort of keep it running. There's issues around issues around in any sort of large open project, issues around governance and what the project is and where it's going. And there are issues around kind of who uses it. People, many people use Wikipedia. Far more people use Wikipedia than sort of contribute to it. Has that same imbalance of scale in terms of the funnel, in terms of users and contributors and kind of core maintainers or administrators. It also faces challenges around the retention of newcomers, which is something in particular that I spent a lot of time working on. One of the things that I'll show you here is actually from the very first talk I gave at SciPy a few years back. This is a plot. In blue, you can sort of see the number of basically the size of the Wikipedian editor community over time. You can see it starts off very small. Even by 2005, it starts to exponentially skyrocket. Wikipedia starts to get really, really popular, and is kind of unprepared for its sort of newfound popularity. And in red, you can see kind of the survival rate of newcomers. So for people who registered or made their first edit in that month, how many people are still contributing to Wikipedia 1 year later? And you can see sort of the community as it started to grow, ended up kind of, having a much, survival rates ended up dropping. And, when I was sort of one of the sort of researchers who was sort of brought in to help sort of when these kind of graphs were first created and people were thinking, what's going on with this? Was brought in as part of a multidisciplinary team of researchers to think about what are the kinds of issues going on. And a lot of people had a lot of different hypotheses. And the short answer is that, well, it's complicated. which is an unsatisfying answer to a lot of people, but it ends up being kind of one of the issues in a lot of these kind of complex social technical systems. Because a lot of people wanted one simple answer with one simple sort of solution that they could have, based on sometimes their own experiences or based on kind of, something that they had seen or sort of spoke to them. And one of the things that we found is there's so many intersecting causes that at the same time sort of contribute to the health of a community, the sustainability of community, and how people feel within that community. And things are often very different for very different kinds of people. People have wide-ranging motivations. People have wide-ranging incentives. We all contain multitudes, and we all think that, we all have different reasons for being here, and we're all in different life situations, and our life situations change in different ways. And so I think it's really important to understand kind of the multiplicity of views, the multiplicity of factors that can go into this. And it's really, I love making sort of charts like this, and since I've been at BIDS, I've been picking up more and more data science along the way to be able to sort of do things like this. But I think it's also important to be able to kind of talk to people and listen to people's stories and understand kind of the people behind these kinds of data, to be able to get a more holistic view of what's going on for a lot of different people. And also, I finally want to sort of talk about, there's been, thinking about the connections to other kinds of, non-digital kind of, spaces is important too, outside of both, software and tech and science. I'm a big fan of Elinor Ostrom's book, Governing the Commons, for which she won the Nobel Prize in economics, doing a lot of research and theorization on how kind of collective infrastructure and common resources sort of, work and don't work. And in fact, Nadia Eghbal in the, Roads and Bridges report, which if you haven't read it, I would sort of highly recommend, directly makes this connection and sort of thinking about, what kinds of, metaphors are kind of, should we be thinking about, what kinds of other spaces, how, what would it look like, and this is sort of, I feel like, an open question that's sort of worth, conversation. What is the right metaphor? If we think of open source as a utility, what does that sort of give us? If we think about it in other sort of ways, what does that get us? And, what's the sort of proper way? What are the right analogies to make? And what are the ones that maybe lead us down some, more complicated or wrong paths? So one of the things that we've been doing over the past couple of years, we've been sort of part of this or the past year or so, we've been part of this project that's been this big multidisciplinary, multi-university collaboration that's been on the visible and invisible work of maintaining an open source digital infrastructure. And we've had this is funded by the Ford and Sloan Foundations, and I'm really thankful to their support, and they're funding a whole cohort of research projects and efforts because they're also sort of thinking about what does it mean to kind of be a good funder in this, and what does it mean to support different kinds of projects, and what do they need in that space. And so we've had a multidisciplinary team of people who are both, have qualitative expertise and quantitative expertise. Those of us on the top side, Mila Leirani and Dorothy Howard at UC San Diego. I've been doing more on the sort of qualitative side of things, and Dorothy's actually here today here at SciPy, and we'll be giving a talk on Friday specifically on burnout. And so I'm not going to talk very much about burnout today, but please come to her talk, or if you have thoughts of that, please or experiences about issues around burnout, please talk to Dorothy or I about this. And it's it's really fantastic and interesting kind of work. And then on the bottom side, Alex Paxton at University of Connecticut and Nelvera Kwa, formerly at BIDS, will soon be at CNRS, and Chris Holgraff at Berkeley. We've also been doing a lot of sort of quantitative work and sort of looking at what you can mine from GitHub and being able to sort of model different kinds of contribution dynamics and how communities are changing, and what are kind of the impacts of, there's a lot of been very kind of micro changes that have been made, both by GitHub as a platform and by some, projects that have instituted new policies, what kind of natural experiments even can be learned from that, and, what are, how are things like bus factors changing, and how are the ways that people interact with each other on issues and comments and threads, how does that sort of change different dynamics around to what extent, people are sort of staying in a community or kind of rising up the ranks or kind of leaving in that sense. And one thing I want to sort of note from this in a lot of our experience is that open source software is many different kinds of things. And I love to kind of do Google image searches for big terms and kind of just see what pops up. It's a very unscientific way of kind of getting a sense of it. But I noticed in this you have, I guess, maybe 3 instances of the OSI logo, but then everything else is just sort of a sort of melange of either word clouds or basically a whole bunch of icons put together in that sense. And it seems like a lot of ways that people depict open source, even in images, is just represented as a whole bunch of things things together. And there is no kind of one open source, and I've learned that, people have a lot of different, there's a lot of, and for a lot of people, open source, they have a lot of investment in that being something about the license. And there's a lot of people who talk about, open source projects, open source communities, or open governance models, or open project models. And for them, it's also not just about the license of the code, but also the operation of the community as well, and the governance structures and things like that. And sort of what it means for those projects, and that's one thing that we've learned in talking with a lot of people, not just in the scientific computing and academic sort of, open source space, but beyond in things like web frameworks or operating systems or other kinds of projects in other sectors, is the just diverse. And so I feel like there's we like to have simple diagnoses of problems and being able to say that these are kind of universal solutions. But in fact, there's so many different versions of open source out there that what works or what works for a project even in the same ecosystem, but that has maybe a handful of contributors and is very specialized, to something that is a very general purpose one that's used by the entire sort of rest of the stack, is maybe might require different kinds of solutions. And same with sort of looking at things that happen in a field like operating systems or kernels versus things that are higher up the stack in the application or library layer. Another kind of side note that I like to do whenever I did this for data science, because I always want to know what data science is. I'm not sure what it is, but it's almost always blue. It's kind of a vague mention of something, but I guess information is blue. I'm not sure what's going on with that. But on this, one of the things that I want to say about getting into the talk about kind of invisible work and that, I want to kind of share something personal. I said I was a little bit anxious about giving this talk because, I'm someone who's, a relative newcomer to the open source software community and into SciPy. It's been very welcoming. Another thing that kind of want to share is I have been, struggling actually relatively recently with some issues around anxiety. And if I can only do one thing in my talk that I take away and kind of normalizing discussions about kind of mental health and about therapy and things like that, I've been trying to work through a lot of my own issues, particularly with kind of social media anxiety and my phone and my notifications. And it's something we can kind of laugh at, and when I think about it, it kind of feels like very much like a first world problem. But, when I think about how much of, my life and our work, takes place in various kinds of even very public platforms, it's something that sort of makes me think about how that's shaping, also as a researcher, how that's shaping the interactions that we have with each other. And in fact, I've kind of gone dark over the public internet over the past maybe 6 to 9 months. I used to be really active on Twitter, or would write blog posts or other kinds of things, and have kind of not been, if you're trying to Google stalk me or sort of follow my digital traces to see what I'm doing, what's going on, you'll find basically almost nothing recently, except for one particular site. Can you guess what that site is? GitHub. Because you kind of can't not do it. And you can even see my GitHub, that graph that's on, even about a year ago today, especially around last year's SciPy, I was doing a lot more on GitHub. I've even dropped off from then, but there's a lot of things that you kind of can't not sort of receive if you're sort of participating in that kind of community. And I even sort of had this project, Academic Pages, which it was basically a GitHub Pages Jekyll template that I took from someone else who made it for more professionals and sort of people in. And I kind of customized a few things and changed some labels and fields to make it specific to academics. And then I wrote up a whole bunch of documentation, mostly for myself to figure out and remind me how to actually do stuff. And then kind of just put it on GitHub and shared it with a few people, and it kind of went viral. And now over 4,500 people sort of use it, and they're starting to sort of find problems with it, or make feature requests, or have things that they want it to do differently, and things that maybe I'm not capable of doing because I don't have that know-how, or things that I don't have the time for because I have other kind of things going on in my life. And every time I kind of get one of those emails from GitHub and I see that come in, I kind of get a little feeling in my chest sometimes about am I going to be able to actually do this, and what is my responsibility, and what is my relationship to these people, and that has given me a lot of empathy, in particular for a lot of the work that is in the positionality that goes into being an open source maintainer in that sense. And it also sort of made me think about this in the context of the sort of broader kind of platformization of kind of our work and life that has been, taking place over the past kind of decade or so. And, it's one of the things about open source software that I think is so powerful and so important is how public many of these kind of open projects and open communities can be. And I'm not going to say that's a bad thing. And, even though I do kind of have a lot of kind of like mediated anxiety, which, might actually feel a little bit weird to some of you who know me, because I'm a very, in person, very extroverted, very outgoing person. Being an extrovert with social anxiety is kind of a 1-2 punch. It's a fun thing. But it's one of those things that, online, for some reason, it's kind of flipped. But I think that one of the things about open source is that we can have one kind of view of an open source project as seen through GitHub. And it gives us this sense, because so much of it is public, so much of the things that we do in open source software are tracked and traced on GitHub. Even to sort of, instead of sending if something's going wrong, you don't send an email to the developers. You register an account and you open up an issue for it. And by putting something on GitHub, anyone can make a pull request and make a comment and suggestion. That's really powerful, and it's just and I'm not going to say that I think it's been really generative and beneficial to the growth and the dynamics of a lot of these communities. But there's sort of one thing that happens when I talk to some of my colleagues who are also kind of ethnographers or social scientists and who do research more on kind of social media in particular. And one of the things that some of them they talk about is this issue around people taking kind of the social media presence to be like a full and accurate representation of everyone else. You look on Facebook and you think, well, everyone else is all happy and doing all these great things, and you kind of take that to be what everyone else is. And the focus on maintaining a particular presence, the obsession that some people can have and get into, that I particularly felt about what it means to kind of represent yourself online, can be kind of intense and subject to a lot of public pressures. And I want to say that because so much of the work in open source software is tracked on public platforms, it's very easy to forget about all the work that takes place outside of them. It can give us kind of a false sense of completeness. So this is something that also as a researcher I have to be mindful of as well. It can seem like, I have such a great view into the internal dynamics of of these projects. And when I talk to some of my colleagues also who study more traditional organizations, businesses or workplaces or especially government or things like that, they're very jealous of the fact that, you can see so much of what's going on internally in those projects and publicly. And I think that but it's important to sort of keep in mind there's also a lot of stuff that goes on that you might not be able to see. And particularly if you're a user and you haven't been in a maintainer position, being able to sort of go through and recognize that if the maintainers sort of maybe aren't doing some things that you've asked of them, maybe it's because they have a whole lot of other things also on their plate. Maybe they haven't been on GitHub in a little while because they're helping organize a sprint or they're helping organize a grant to be able to sort of fund particular kinds of work. And understanding that the GitHub repository does not fully represent a project, can be a really important thing when we think about what it means to recognize work and think about what it means to have a relationship between maintainers and users, or even maintainers to each other. In fact, there's this sort of thing in the social media space. This is actually an ad I took from a company that I blocked the name because I don't want to give them free press, but this idea that, life isn't perfect, your profile should be. They're a company that kind of curates and manages your online presence and be able to do that. And I feel like that's a very unhealthy way of thinking about it. But I think it's important to kind of understand and set the norms and understand, what is going to happen on GitHub and what's going to be represented there, and what are maybe other ways that we can sort of recognize the work that doesn't take place there, and what are kind of the ways that metrics and incentives can be sort of developed to be able to sort of balance that and provide a more holistic view as opposed of a particular project. So I want to bring this up in the case of a case that you might sort of be very well familiar with, is Dr. Katie Bauman, who was became famous for sort of having this image, the first image recorded of a black hole. And and one of the things you probably know about this story because it was done in a very open science way and was built on particularly a lot of the sort of projects in the SciPy community. And it was sort of a big cause for celebration, I know, both among sort of in the scientific community as well as in the open source community. But I want to talk about kind of a darker side that kind of happened in this story. story, which was that almost immediately there were, basically a bunch of kind of trolls and the people who, found the GitHub repository for a particular project that wasn't even the core project for the actual one, but it was, one of the ones that she and her team had worked on. And they had went to, they knew just enough to be dangerous. They went to the insights and the statistics, and they found, 80% of the lines of code committed to this repository was not committed by her, but committed by someone else who was a man. And they made all these like misogynistic comments and harassed her on Twitter and sort of sent all these kind of nasty messages and kind of said a lot of things about how, she's not the real leader of this project. We should recognize this other guy who, committed 80% of the lines of code. And that guy actually came back on Twitter and Reddit and all the other places they were spewing this and said, no, I basically uploaded a bunch of data files and auto-configuration files. If you're using lines of code as a metric to understand like who did the most work in a project, that can be really dangerous. That can be, in fact, there's a lot of stuff in that project that didn't even get tracked on GitHub. And so if you want to understand, and actually there's a piece that Motherboard or a blog post wrote that kind of really does a good job, and they talk to a lot of people in software about like what does it mean to value code and why lines of code is a really bad metric. And a lot of you probably know that by heart, that lines of code is like not a great metric for understanding that, and like refactoring can like change 5 lines of code, but take a whole month to be able to do something well. To understand that, there's a really good place to sort of take that and turn it, but I feel like it's an important story to share because it's about the need to understand and value work, and it's not coincidental that it's also an issue about gender and representation and diversity and inclusion, and understanding. And this is one of the things that also goes hand in hand with a lot of the existing scholarship that's taking place on invisible work and kind of the recognition of work, is that there's sort of vast inequities in these and certain kinds of ways of recognizing work can reinforce biases and can reinforce many kinds of structural inequalities. And it's a very important thing to think very carefully about how we recognize work and what kind of ways that we do and what are the processes for that. And so I don't want to blame GitHub too much. I actually really like some of the things that they've been doing. I love that they replaced the streak, which is the number of days that you would continuously committed code in a row, and which is very mentally unhealthy, to leads to some very bad work-life balance and burnout issues, to this more holistic view of even the things that you do on GitHub and representing the spider plot of the different kinds of work and saying it's not just about commits as well, it's also about code review and issues and things like that. And pull requests and the work. I think I know internally they're doing a lot of work thinking about what better statistics they can use and what kind of more nuanced ways they can have to give better insights that more holistically, represent this. Or even kind of things like, breaking up commits. One thing that, on the quantitative side, I know that Nell and Alex have been working on in particular and Chris, is documentation, being able to distinguish documentation commits and being able to understand the different kinds of work that happens there. And so I want to sort of give a little bit of talk about the different kinds of invisible work in open source software. This is actually a graphic that was commissioned by Karthik Graham, who's the co-founder of the ROpenSci project and sits right next to me at BIDS. And he commissioned these two sort of artists to sort of have a couple, these really cute drawings, and there's a link to his talk, which I recommend you sort of look at, about different kinds of things that sort of get made invisible or sort of less recognized, including things like writing documentation, filing issues, raising funds. Some of these things do get tracked on GitHub, and some of them take place outside. Thinking about longer-term priorities, road mapping can involve a lot of work, and it sort of appears as something that maybe just anyone could have sort of written up a roadmap. But roadmaps can really take a substantial amount of time, not just to write them up and think about them, but to consult with everyone else who's going on about what the project needs. Organizing conferences, which I already mentioned, conferences are really important, but especially even fundraising to get support for conferences and sprints and other things is a form of invisible work too. Automating workflows, build systems, continuous integration. These things can be crucially important as well. I'd add kind of testing in that as well. But also, it's something that can take a massive amount of work just to keep the CI kind of flowing and running. Sharing new information and talking to people one-on-one, working with, upskilling new teammates, working with people on pull requests to sort of get them up to the standards or where they need to be for a particular project. These are all things that, aren't sort of the flashy things that, can, easily make a sort of changelog in a feature release, or sort of go viral if you're sort of releasing a GIF of a new thing that happened on Twitter with this new particular project. But things that are important to talk about and think about in terms of how we reward and understand projects. And I want to give, in particular, documentation is one thing that we thought a lot about. We actually wrote a paper together about documentation. If you go to tinyurl.com/ossdocs, all the issues and problems and roles and importance of documentation and why a lot of people don't do as much documentation work as maybe they think that they should, and issues around how to sort of respond to that. I also want to give a shout out to the all contributors typology, and this is a really cool project that is pretty new, and I feel like it kind of deserves a signal boost in this. Allcontributors.org, they've created a whole list of different things, each with their own emoji, of different kinds of tasks that happen in open source. And they're open source, so if you see anything that's not on this list that you think is important, make a pull request. And they've also developed a lot of really interesting software tools and bots and infrastructure that link into GitHub and Slack and other things, so that you can say, oh, this person helped raise funds to help run a sprint, and we can be able to take that and then have kind of a gallery where it shows different kinds of roles and work that people have done. And I think it's a little bit of extra work, but they try to make that a little as seamless as they can in order to make it and facilitate the process of recognizing and the wide variety of roles and works that take place in open source. And I also kind of want to give a shout out to there's another talk that Tanya Riley gives on being glue, and if you search for being glue, you can find the full slide deck for this. And understanding a lot of this work is crucial work that happens not just in open source, but in industry and other kind of teams as well. And she's talking about this in the context of a lot of kind of workplaces, but how engineering team success is not just about showing up and churning code, but a lot of the work that happens is work that is in stitching people together and being able to support that. But that work is often not seen as technical work or sort of real work, and it often falls to juniors who don't get sort of properly recognized, but sort of help everyone else out. And it's not quite being a product manager, but it's also but it also goes kind of above and beyond what most people in sort of software development roles sort of do. And she also notes this thing that in her experience and cites some research that these kind of tasks are disproportionately given to women, particularly things around organizing events or taking notes, or even cleaning up after particular spaces, or keeping people in conversation with each other. And that's something that I feel like should be really thought about in terms of who is doing the invisible work and more equitably understanding how those things can be distributed and how they can be made everyone's responsibility, as opposed to just falling to as opposed to things that are going to sort of reinforce some already sort of problematic inequalities that we have in society. And so with that, I want to kind of, I'm nearing the end of my time. I want to kind of end with this kind of, thing that I opened up with, which is that a good infrastructure is hard to find. And in your sort of work in open source, and those of you who I think you all sort of said, almost all of you said you use open source software, one of the things that can be very frustrating with infrastructure, and Bauker and Stark have noted this, is that it becomes most visible when it breaks down. And that's the moment in which you start to realize, oh, I really rely on this quite a bit. The power goes out and you're like, I haven't had to think about power in a long time. The Wi-Fi doesn't work. And then you're realizing, oh, all the times that I just opened up my laptop and it did work. And or something gets committed and there's maybe there's a new release that kind of breaks something, and you can realize, oh, I haven't had to think about this particular package way downstream from me in a long time. Those can be moments of frustration. Those are often moments when people send really nasty messages, even inadvertently, not thinking about it, but the kind of, the distress that they might have about having their own workflow interrupted can actually be really demotivating to people who are doing that kind of work. And so I think the next time you are in one of those moments where the infrastructure breaks and it suddenly reveals to you a whole bunch of frustration, it takes you out of your flow, it takes you out of your work, it's suddenly visible to you, think about first all the times when that didn't happen, all the times in which you were able to kind of seamlessly and freely kind of go about what it is you wanted to do because you didn't have to think about it. And maybe don't send that message, or if you're going to file, let them, they probably know before you do that something is sort of happening. Maybe send a polite message, but a little while later say, I didn't, maybe send something like, I know this broke, and I know you're sort of working on it. It's been really great. I didn't realize how much I relied on this until this broke, and not as a sort of sign of shame or as saying that you should have done better. Don't be judgmental, but just as a way to think about and to recognize what you take for granted and what you rely on in that. And so with that, thank you so much for your time, and I'd love to take any questions, and feel free to get in touch. I want to thank so much to the SciPy organizers, our funders, Moore, Sloan, and Ford, and every single person who has talked to us about open source software. There's like too many names to list in this particular sort of list, but we'd love to sort of chat more. Please come and talk to me or Dorothy or Chris at the conference, and if you want to get in touch, send me an email, stuart@stuartgeiger.com, and we'd love to sort of hear your thoughts more. I'm sure there's a lot of stuff we're missing and a lot of stuff that, goes beyond what we're looking for. We're all ears and really interested to hear where you think we should be going next. Thank you.
There is a mic in the back if people want to use that to ask questions of Stuart, or I can run around and hand.
Hi, great talk. A lot of that stuff really spoke to me. But I'm curious if you have any thoughts about how we spread this to our wider communities, right? The people that you're talking about that, let's say, are somewhat demotivating for open source maintainers, I think are less likely to be in this room. So how do we reach out to them and tell them all of these things you just said today, that they really are the ones who need to hear it?
Wait, to the users or to the maintainers?
Users mostly is
yeah.
what I'm talking about, like the users of this code that are not ever going to come to a SciPy conference.
No, that's a really good point. I mean, I might say share this talk. I don't know, that's self-serving. But no, I feel like also kind of just raising these kinds of issues, that's a really good question. Actually, I feel like one of the things around this is getting people to understand particularly what they're even using. And so much of this work is built on it's a stack that's, it's built, you're not even sort of realizing all the things down the stack that you're particularly using. I do love that GitHub just did the thing that has the kind of how many things that it's relied upon, being able to make that visible. And I know that being able to, I think it can take a small amount of effort to set a norm or an expectation that if you're using one of these things to be able to publicly declare that you are using it. I'm a big fan of like the software citation movement and the Journal of Open Source Software and things that they've been doing in order to sort of provide more recognition. So if you're writing a paper that does this, cite it. If you're reviewing a paper, demand that they cite the software that they use, and being able to set an expectation more broadly that others will follow, where it will be the norm to be able to say, here's the whole suite of things that I'm using as a part of this, in the same way that it's kind of the norm and a lot of work to sort of say basic methodological facts about where you got your data and things like that.
Hey, over here. Sir? Hi. Thanks. So, yeah, really great talk. And I'm a non-scientist and a non-coder, just a civilian. And I saw a lot of parallels between this and maybe just the scientific community as well, right? The academic community as well. And I was wondering if you had any thoughts about that and all the psychological challenges that come along with it.
No, yeah, this is something that I feel like has been a continual issue in academic research, is kind of the valuation of, and as someone who is an academic and has gone through, had my own experiences with that kind of incentive and career structure, I feel that very much about what gets rewarded and what doesn't. But I do think that, like the work of science, extensively relies, we think a lot about, on people who are particularly in students or kind of even volunteers, things like citizen science are increasingly growing. I know those communities are also having a lot of conversations about what it means to value, a lot of the work that, isn't sort of done by the sort of, the lead professor, and how do you sort of build, good, structures so that it, brings people up and sort of shares a lot of, as opposed to something that, where the credit kind of just goes to the people who already kind of have the credit. I feel like that's an important conversation that happens not just in science, but I feel like in any kind of business, in any kind of where there's like a leadership and a hiring structure and a promotion structure, making those conversations more explicit and kind of talking about these issues openly, and making them not kind of taboo things to talk about, but normalizing them, I feel like is a really important thing. It's not just navel gazing, it's really important.
We're at the break time, so let's, Stuart will be around if you want to continue the conversation, and let's thank him for a fantastic keynote.